of Wake Island began simultaneously with the attack on Pearl Harbor and ended on December 23, 1941, with the surrender of American forces to the Empire of Japan. It was fought by and over the atoll formed by Wake Island and its islets of Pierre and Wilkes Islands by the air, and with land and naval forces of the Empire of Japan against those of the U.S., with Marines playing a prominent role on both sides.
The island was held by the Japanese for the duration of the Pacific War. The remaining Japanese garrison on the island surrendered to a detachment of United States Marines on September 4, 1945. In January 1941, the United States Navy constructed a military base on the atoll on August 19th, the first permanent military garrison. Understrength elements of the 1st Marine Defense Battalion, totaling 450 officers and men, were stationed on the island, under Major James P. S. Devereaux. Also present on the island were 68 U.S. naval personnel and about 1,221 civilian workers for the Morrison Knudsen. 45 Chamorro men were employed by Pan American Airways at the company's facilities in Wake Island. One of the stops on the Pan American Clipper Trans-Pacific Air Service, initiated in 1935. The Marines were armed with 6 5-inch 51 cal pieces originating from the battleship USS Texas, 12 3-inch 50 caliber anti-aircraft guns with only a single working anti-aircraft director among them, 18 50-inch Browning heavy machine guns, and 30-inch heavy, medium, and light water and air-cooled machine guns of various manufacturing and operating conditions. On November 28th, Commander Winfield S. Cunningham reported to Wake to assume overall command of U.S. forces on the island. He had only 10 days to examine defenses and assess his men before war began. On December 8th, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Wake being on the opposite side of the international date line, 36 Japanese Mitsubishi G3M3 medium bombers flown from bases on the Marshall Islands attacked Wake Island, destroying 8 of the 12 F-4, F-3 Wildcats belonging to Marine Corps Fighter Squadron VMF 211 on the ground. The remaining 4 Wildcats were in the air patrolling, but because of poor visibility, failed to see the attacking Japanese bombers. These Wildcats did down 2 bombers on the following day. However, all of the Marine garrison's defense emplacements were left intact by the rain, which primarily targeted the naval aircraft. Of 55 Marine aviation personnel, 23 were killed and 11 were wounded. Following this attack, the Pan American employees were evacuated, along with the passengers of a Clipper flying boat that had survived the attack unscathed. The Chamorro men were not allowed to board the plane and were left behind. 2 or more air raids followed, in which the main camp was targeted on December 9th, resulting in destruction of the civilian hospital and the Pan American facility, and on December 10th, during which the bombers focused on Wilkes Island. Following the raid on December 9th, the guns had been relocated in case the Japanese had photographed the positions. Wooden replicas were erected in their place, and the Japanese bombers attacked the decoy positions. A lucky strike on a civilian dynamite supply set off a chain reaction and destroyed the munitions for the guns on Wilkes. Early on the morning of December 11th, the garrison, with the support of the 4 remaining Wildcats, repelled the first Japanese landing attempt by the South Seas Force, which included the light cruisers Yurabi, Tenryu, and Tatsuta, the destroyers Yayoi, Mutsaki, Kisarigi, Hayate, Oite, and Hasanagi, 2 Monmi-class destroyers converted to patrol boats, Patrol Boat Number 32 and Patrol Boat Number 33, and 2 troop transports ships containing 450 Special Navy Landing Force troops. The U.S. Marines fired at the invasion fleet with their 6 5-inch coastal artillery guns. Major Devereaux, the Marine commander, under Cunningham, ordered the gunners to hold their fire until the enemy moved within range of the coastal defenses. Battery L on the PL Islet succeeded in sinking Hayate at a distance of 4,000 yards. with at least 2 direct hits to her magazines, causing her to explode and sink within 2 minutes, in full view of the defenders on shore. Yarabi's superstructure was hit 11 times. The 4 Wildcats also succeeded in sinking the destroyer Kisargi by dropping a bomb on her stern where the depth charges were stored. Both Japanese destroyers were lost with all hands, with Hayate becoming the first Japanese surface warship to be sunk during World War II. The Japanese force withdrew before landing. This was the first Japanese setback of the war against the Americans. The first landing setback so far is the latest time in history that a forced amphibious landing attempt has been repelled by just shore batteries. After the initial raid was fought off, American news media reported that when queried about reinforcements and resupply, Cunningham was reported to have quipped, "Send us more Japs!" In fact, Commander Cunningham sent a long list of critical equipment, including gun sights, spare parts, and fire control radar, to his immediate superior, Commandment 14th Naval District. It is believed that the quip was actually padding, a technique of adding nonsense text to a message to make cryptanalysis more difficult. But the continuing siege and frequent Japanese air attacks on the Wake garrison continued, without resupply for the Americans. The initial resistance offered by the garrison prompted the Japanese Navy to detach the aircraft cruisers carriers Soryu and Hiryu from the force that attacked Pearl Harbor to support the second landing attempt. The projected U.S. relief attempt by Admiral Frank Fletcher's Task Force 11, and supported by Admiral Wilson Brown's TF-14, consisted of the fleet carrier Saratoga, the fleet oiler Neches, the seaplane tender Tangier, the heavy cruisers Astoria, Minneapolis, and San Francisco, and 10 destroyers. The convoy carried the 4th Marine Defense Battalion, the VMF 221 Fighter Squadron equipped with Brewster F-2A-3 Buffalo fighters, along with 9,000 5-inch rounds, 12,000 3-inch rounds, and 3 million 50-inch rounds, as well as a large amount of ammunition for mortars and other battalion small arms. TF-14 with the fleet carrier Lexington, 3 heavy cruisers, 8 destroyers, and an oiler, was to undertake a raid on the Marshall Islands to divert Japanese attention. At 2100 on December 22nd, after receiving information indicating the presence of 2 Imperial Japanese Navy carriers and 2 fast battleships, which were actually heavy cruisers, near Wake Island, Vice Admiral William S. Pye, the acting commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, ordered TF-11 to return to Pearl Harbor for fear of losses. The second Japanese invasion force came on December 23rd, composed mostly of the same ships from the first attempt, with the major reinforcements of the carriers Hiryu and Soryu, plus 1,500 Japanese Marines. The landings began at 2:35, where after a preliminary bombardment, the ex-destroyers Patrol Boat No. 32 and Patrol Boat No. 33 were beached and burned in their attempts to land the invasion force. After a full night and morning of fighting, the Wake garrison surrendered to the Japanese by mid-afternoon. The U.S. Marines lost 49 killed and 2 MIA during the entire 15-day siege, while 3 U.S. Navy personnel and at least 70 U.S. civilians were killed, including 10 Chamorros civilians and 12 civilians wounded. Japanese losses were recorded at between 700 to 900 killed, with at least 300 or more wounded, in addition to the 2 destroyers lost in the first invasion attempt, and at least 28 landing-based and carrier aircraft either shot or damaged. The Japanese captured all men remaining on the island, the majority of whom were civilian contractors employed with Morrison Knudsen Company. Captain Henry T. Elrod, one of the pilots from VMF 211, was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously from his action on the island during the second landing attempt, having shot down 2 Japanese A-6M2 Zeros and sunk the Japanese destroyer Kisaragi, and a special military decoration, the Wake Island device, affixed to either the Navy Expeditionary Medal or the Marine Corps Expeditionary Medal, was created to honor those who had fought in the defense of the island. Fearing an imminent invasion, the Japanese reinforced Wake Island with more formidable defenses. The American captives were ordered to build a series of bunkers and fortifications on Wake. The Japanese brought in an 8-inch naval gun, which is often incorrectly reported as having been captured in Singapore. The U.S. Navy established a submarine blockade instead of an amphibious invasion of Wake Island. As a result, the Japanese garrison starved, which led to the extinction of an endemic bird. On February 24, 1942, aircraft from the carrier Enterprise attacked the Japanese garrison on Wake Island. U.S. forces bombed the island periodically from 1942 until Japan's surrender in 1945. On July 24, 1943, Consolidated B-24 Liberators, led by Lieutenant Jesse Stay of the 42nd Squadron of the U.S. Army Air Forces in transit from Midway Island, struck the Japanese garrison on Wake Island. At least 2 men from that raid were awarded Distinguished Flying Crosses for their efforts. Future President George Herbert W. Bush also conducted his first combat mission as a naval aviator over Wake Island. After this, Wake was occasionally raided but never attacked en masse. On October 5, 1943, American naval aircraft from Yorktown raided Wake. 2 days later, fearing an imminent invasion, the Japanese Rear Admiral Shigematsu Sakaibara ordered the execution of the 98 captured American civilian workers who had initially been kept to perform forced labor. The 98 were taken to the northern end of the island, blindfolded and executed with a machine gun. One of the prisoners, whose name has never been discovered, escaped the massacre, apparently returning to the site to carve the message 98 USPW 51043 on a large coral rock near where the victims had been hastily buried in a mass grave. The unknown American was recaptured and Sakibara personally beheaded him with a katana. The inscription on the rock can still be seen and is a Wake Island landmark. On September 4th, the remaining Japanese garrison surrendered to a detachment of U.S. Marines. The handover of Wake was officially conducted in a brief ceremony aboard the destroyer escort Levy. After the war, Sakibara and his subordinate Lieutenant Commander Tachibana were sentenced to death for the massacre of the 98 and for other war crimes. Several Japanese officers in American custody had committed suicide over the incident, leaving written statements that incriminated Sakibara. Admiral Sakibara was hanged on June 18, 1947. Eventually, Tachibana's sentence was commuted to life in prison. The murdered civilian POWs were reburied after the war in Honolulu's National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, commonly known as Punch Bowl Crater. William L. Taylor, like many of the Wake Island POWs, was relocated to China for forced labor for the Japanese Army. In 1945, he was traveling on a Japanese train as part of a work detail from Shanghai when he escaped with Jack Hernandez by jumping off the train when Japanese guards were not looking. Hernandez broke his leg and was forced to stay as Taylor continued his journey down the line. Taylor met up with Chinese communist soldiers, who he quoted as saying, "You're okay now. We are friends with the Americans." After 10 weeks of traveling with the Chinese communists in northern China, he was able to contact American military forces, who called for a plane to pick him up and take him to an American base in northern China. Before he left China, he met Mao Zedong, who gave him a gift of Chinese rugs and told him he was the only POW who had successfully come through North China. In an interview with the History Channel during the episode Wake Island, the Alamo of the Pacific, he claims that Mao saved his life. The Paramount Studio began work on a movie even before the real-life battle for Wake Island was over. The resulting 1942 film, directed by John Farrow, tacks unrelated romantic subplots onto a straightforward retelling of the battle. The film contains numerous factual errors, leaving viewers with the impression that the island's defenders fought to the last man, that the island's naval commander was killed in a bombing raid. He survived. That cruisers, rather than the smaller destroyers, were sunk, and that the island defense was in the hands of USMC officers. However, the film succeeded with its primary propaganda purpose of creating a stirring patriotic film. Wake Island was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. Farrow won the 1942 New York Film Critics Circle Award for Best Director. A 2003 television documentary, Wake Island, Alamo of the Pacific, included interviews with both U.S. Marines and Japanese sailors who took part in the fighting. The film received a 2004 Emmy nomination for music and sound. In the 2002 computer game Battlefield 1942, players can play on the map Wake Island, a fair copy of the island, during the second attack of the Japanese. In the 2009 video game Battlefield 1943, a later installment of the Battlefield series, players are again able to play the map Wake Island. In the 1994 film Pulp Fiction, Christopher Walken's character Captain Coons references the battle when re-encountering the somewhat painful journey of the young Butch Calig's father wristwatch. The end.